The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty plains when young Jake Morrison first spotted the white wolf at the watering hole. He'd been tracking cattle thieves for 3 days, his Winchester rifle heavy in his calloused hands, sweat staining his worn leather vest despite the cool dawn air. The landscape stretched endlessly before him, rolling hills covered in sagebrush, distant mesas rising like ancient monuments against the pale sky, and the precious water source that meant life or death for every living creature in this harsh territory. Jake had inherited this land from his father, who had died defending it from rustlers just 2 years prior, leaving behind a struggling ranch and a teenage daughter who depended entirely on Jake's ability to make the operation profitable. When the magnificent creature appeared like a ghost against the red clay earth, Jake's breath caught in his throat. The wolf was unlike any he had ever seen, larger than normal, with a pristine coat that gleamed silver white in the dawn light, and eyes that seemed to hold an ancient wisdom. Its movements were graceful and deliberate, not the skulking behavior he expected from a predator. For a moment, Jake hesitated, his finger frozen on the trigger as something deep in his gut warned him that this was no ordinary animal. There was something almost otherworldly about the creature, something that made every instinct scream that he was about to make a terrible mistake. But then the practical realities of frontier life crashed back into his consciousness. Over the past month, he had lost 6 calves to predators, their torn carcasses found scattered across his grazing lands. The missing livestock represented not just financial loss, but potential starvation for his family during the coming winter. His sister Mary, barely 16 and still grieving their father's death, had been rationing their food supplies and mending clothes until they were more patched than original fabric. The bank in Copper Creek had already extended their loan twice, and the next payment was due in less than 6 weeks. Jake couldn't afford sentiment when survival was at stake. With a steady breath and a whispered prayer for forgiveness, he squeezed the trigger. The shot echoed across the plains like thunder, and the sacred guardian of the Lakota nation fell silent forever, its white coat slowly staining red as its life ebbed away into the thirsty earth. As Jake approached the fallen animal, he noticed details that made his stomach churn with unease. The wolf was thinner than it should have been, its ribs visible beneath the magnificent coat. Its teeth, when he pried open the jaws, showed signs of illness, not the healthy fangs of a successful predator, but the yellowed, worn teeth of an animal that had been struggling to survive. What Jake didn't know was that he had just shattered a peace treaty that had stood for over 2 decades, carefully negotiated by his own father and Chief Standing Bear during the violent conflicts of the 1860s. The white wolf wasn't just any predator. It was Wakantanka's messenger, the sacred protector that maintained the delicate balance between the rancher's cattle, the tribal hunting grounds, and the life-giving waters that sustained both peoples. According to Lakota tradition, the white wolf was the earthly embodiment of the Great Spirit's will, sent to ensure that no single group would dominate the land to the exclusion of others. The wolf's presence at the watering hole had been a sign of blessing, indicating that the waters were pure and that the land remained in harmony. Its death would be interpreted not as the elimination of a threat, but as the destruction of the spiritual contract that had allowed 2 very different cultures to coexist on the vast frontier. As the wolf's blood seeped into the earth, it carried with it the harmony that had prevented countless conflicts over grazing rights, water access, and territorial boundaries. Before you continue with this tale of unexpected consequences and forbidden love, I'd love for you to subscribe to our channel and let me know in the comments what city you're watching from. Your support helps us bring these incredible stories of the American frontier to life. Within hours of the shooting, smoke signals rose from the distant mesas carrying news of the sacred wolf's death to Chief Standing Bear's village in a complex code that had been used by the Lakota for generations. The signals spoke not just of the animal's death, but of the manner of its killing, the location where it fell, and the identity of the man responsible. Tribal scouts had been watching the Morrison Ranch for weeks, not out of hostility, but as part of their traditional responsibility to monitor the movements of all creatures, human and animal, within their ancestral territory. The tribal council convened under the ancient cottonwood tree that had served as their meeting place for over a century, its massive trunk scarred by bullets from past conflicts, but still standing strong as a symbol of endurance. The elders arrived in order of age and wisdom, each taking their designated place in the sacred circle, while the younger warriors stood guard at the perimeter. Chief Standing Bear, now in his 60th year but still commanding in presence, called for the talking stick to be brought forth, a carved piece of sacred wood that had been passed down through 7 generations of tribal leaders. The discussion that followed was conducted entirely in the old language, with each elder speaking in turn about the implications of this act. Some argued for immediate retaliation, pointing out that the white settlers had been gradually encroaching on tribal lands for years, using every excuse to justify their expansion. Others counseled patience, remembering the devastating wars of the previous decades and the terrible cost in lives on both sides. But all agreed on one fundamental point. According to the old laws, the killing of the white wolf was not just an offense against nature. It was a declaration of war against the spirits themselves. The penalty was clear, established by traditions that predated the arrival of Europeans on the continent. Either the guilty party must face death in ritual combat, or he must marry into the tribe, binding his bloodline to theirs, and ensuring that such a transgression could never happen again. The marriage option was not offered out of mercy, but as a practical solution that would create lasting peace through the most powerful bond known to human society, the joining of families. When the council's decision reached the Morrison Ranch, delivered by a young Lakota warrior who spoke perfect English, Jake's world turned upside down. He had 48 hours to present himself at the tribal village, or face the consequences of a war that would consume everything he held dear. The messenger, a man named Swift Arrow who had been educated at a mission school, explained the situation with clinical precision, making it clear that this was not a negotiation, but an ultimatum. Jake spent that night pacing the small cabin he shared with his sister, trying to comprehend how his life had changed so dramatically in the space of a single gunshot. Mary wept quietly in the corner, understanding that either choice would mean losing the only family she had left. If Jake chose death, she would be left alone on a failing ranch with no protection and no means of support. If he chose marriage, he would be lost to her just as surely, absorbed into a culture she had been taught to fear and distrust. As dawn approached, Jake made his decision. He would go to the tribal village and accept whatever fate awaited him there. It was the only choice that offered any hope for his sister's survival, even if it meant sacrificing his own freedom. He spent his final morning writing letters, one to Mary explaining his choice, another to the bank requesting an extension on their loan, and a third to his cousin in Kansas, asking him to look after Mary if the worst should happen. Chief Standing Bear's daughter, Ayanna, received the news of her impending marriage with the same stoic composure that had made her the most respected tracker and healer in 3 territories. At 24, she possessed an uncanny ability to read the land like others read books, seeing patterns in animal tracks, weather signs, and human behavior that escaped even the most experienced frontiersmen. Her education had been unconventional but thorough, taught by her grandmother in the traditional ways of plant medicine and spiritual healing, while also learning English and mathematics from a sympathetic missionary who had lived with the tribe for several years. Ayanna's hands, steady and sure, had saved countless lives with her knowledge of medicinal plants and ancient healing practices. She could identify over 200 different herbs and their uses, prepare poultices that could heal infected wounds, and brew teas that could break fevers that had stumped white doctors. Her reputation extended far beyond her own tribe. Settlers throughout the territory had quietly sought her help when their own medical knowledge proved inadequate, though few would admit it publicly. She had never expected to marry for political reasons, having turned down several suitors who sought her hand for her father's influence rather than her own worth. 3 different tribal warriors had asked for her hand, each offering substantial bride prices and promising to elevate her status within the community. She had refused them all, not out of pride, but because she sensed that their interest lay more in the political advantages of marrying the chief's daughter than in any genuine affection for her as a person. Now, faced with the prospect of binding herself to a white rancher who had killed their most sacred protector, she felt the weight of her people's survival resting on her shoulders. The decision to offer marriage instead of demanding blood had not been made lightly, and she understood that her acceptance was crucial to preventing a war that could destroy everything her people had worked to build. Yet something in the description of Jake Morrison, his youth, his obvious remorse when told of his crime, the fact that he had chosen to come voluntarily rather than flee, sparked a curiosity she couldn't quite explain. Ayanna had seen enough of white men to know that they were not all the same. Some, like the missionary who had taught her English, showed genuine respect for her people's ways. Others, like the traders who came through the territory, saw the Lakota only as obstacles to profit or sources of exotic entertainment. She wondered which type Jake Morrison would prove to be, and whether it was possible for a marriage born of necessity to grow into something more meaningful. The town of Copper Creek buzzed with outrage when news of the arranged marriage spread through the saloons and general stores like wildfire. The settlement, which had grown from a mining camp to a proper town over the past decade, prided itself on being a bastion of civilization in the wilderness. The main street boasted a bank, a general store, a hotel, and 3 saloons, while the residential areas featured neat wooden houses with picket fences and carefully tended gardens that represented the settlers' determination to impose order on the chaotic frontier. Mayor Hutchins, a portly man with political ambitions and a carefully waxed mustache, saw an opportunity to rally the settlers against what he called savage demands and barbaric customs. He had arrived in Copper Creek 5 years earlier, with dreams of becoming a territorial representative, but his political career had stalled due to his tendency to make inflammatory speeches that alienated moderate voters. The crisis over Jake Morrison's forced marriage gave him exactly the kind of dramatic issue he needed to reinvigorate his political prospects. He organized town meetings in the largest saloon, where angry voices called for armed resistance, claiming that no white man should be forced to submit to tribal law. The rhetoric grew more heated each day, with some suggesting they should simply drive the Lakota from their ancestral lands once and for all. Hutchins encouraged these sentiments, painting vivid pictures of what would happen if they allowed savages to dictate terms to civilized people. He spoke of slippery slopes and dangerous precedents, warning that submission in this case would lead to complete tribal domination of the territory. But behind the scenes, a more sinister force was at work. Baron Silver, a wealthy mine owner from back east, had been eyeing the mineral-rich lands that bordered both the Morrison Ranch and the tribal territory for over 2 years. His geological surveys had revealed significant deposits of silver and copper in the mountains that formed the boundary between white and Lakota lands, but legal complications had prevented him from filing claims in the disputed areas. A war between the settlers and the Lakota would give him the perfect excuse to claim those lands for his mining operations, especially if he could position himself as the man who brought peace through industrial development. He quietly funded the most vocal agitators while maintaining a public facade of neutrality, sending anonymous donations to support Hutchins' rallies, while also hiring private investigators to gather intelligence on both the tribal leadership and the local ranchers. Baron Silver's plan was elegant in its simplicity: escalate the conflict until federal intervention became necessary, then position his mining company as the solution to the Indian problem by offering to develop the disputed lands in exchange for military protection. He had used similar tactics in Colorado and Montana, always managing to acquire valuable mineral rights at a fraction of their true worth, while maintaining his reputation as a legitimate businessman. Jake Morrison rode into the Lakota village on a gray morning, his heart heavy with dread and uncertainty. He had spent the previous night writing letters to his younger sister, not knowing if he would ever see her again. The journey from his ranch had taken him through landscape he had never seen before, following ancient trails that wound through hidden valleys and across streams that didn't appear on any white man's map. His guide, Swift Arrow, had maintained a respectful silence throughout the journey, but Jake could sense the young warrior's curiosity about this white man who had chosen honor over flight. The village was larger than he had expected, with dozens of teepees arranged in careful patterns around a central fire pit that never went out. The structures were not the crude shelters he had imagined, but sophisticated dwellings decorated with intricate designs that told the stories of the families who lived within them. Children stopped their games to stare at him with wide, curious eyes, while warriors watched from the shadows with hands resting on their weapons. The air was filled with the sounds of daily life, women singing as they worked, dogs barking, horses nickering in the nearby corral, and the constant murmur of conversation in a language he didn't understand. Jake noticed immediately that the village was prosperous and well organized. The teepees were made of high-quality buffalo hide, decorated with painted symbols and hung with ornaments that spoke of skilled craftsmanship. Gardens of corn, beans, and squash flourished in the fertile soil near the river, while herds of horses grazed in carefully managed pastures. This was not the primitive encampment he had expected, but a sophisticated community that had adapted traditional ways to the realities of frontier life. Chief Standing Bear emerged from the largest teepee, his weathered face unreadable as he studied the young rancher who had brought this crisis upon them all. The chief was an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered despite his age, with silver hair braided with eagle feathers and a presence that commanded immediate respect. His clothing was simple but elegant, a buckskin shirt decorated with intricate beadwork, leather leggings, and moccasins that had been crafted with obvious care. Around his neck hung a necklace of bear claws and sacred stones, symbols of his authority and spiritual power. Beside him walked Ayanna, and Jake felt his breath catch in his throat. She was nothing like what he had expected, not the savage princess of frontier tales, but a woman of quiet dignity and unmistakable intelligence. Her dark hair was braided with silver ornaments, and she wore a dress of soft doeskin decorated with patterns that seemed to shift and flow in the morning light. Her dark eyes met his with a directness that made him feel as though she could see straight through to his soul, reading his fears and uncertainties as easily as she might read tracks in the dust. The formal introduction was conducted according to ancient protocols that Jake barely understood. Chief Standing Bear spoke first in Lakota, his words carrying the weight of ceremony and tradition. Swift Arrow translated, explaining that the chief was acknowledging Jake's courage in coming voluntarily and expressing hope that this union would bring healing to both peoples. Jake's response, halting and inadequate as it seemed, was received with solemn nods from the assembled elders. When Ayanna spoke, her voice was clear and melodious, carrying an accent that made her English sound almost musical. She welcomed him to her father's village and expressed her willingness to honor the agreement that would preserve peace between their peoples. There was no warmth in her words, but neither was there hostility, only a kind of resigned acceptance that spoke of her understanding of duty and sacrifice. The marriage ceremony took place at sunset, conducted according to ancient traditions that Jake barely understood. The entire village gathered in a great circle around the central fire, which had been built up until the flames reached toward the darkening sky. Tribal elders chanted in their native tongue, their voices rising and falling in harmonies that seemed to echo the rhythms of the natural world. The ceremony began with purification rituals. Both Jake and Ayanna were blessed with sacred smoke and sprinkled with water from the holy spring, where the white wolf had died. Jake stood beside Ayanna as the tribal elders continued their chanting, feeling like an intruder in a sacred ritual that connected this people to traditions stretching back countless generations. The ceremony was unlike anything he had ever experienced, not the simple exchange of vows he was familiar with from Christian weddings, but a complex ritual that seemed to bind not just two individuals, but their entire families and communities. When it came time to exchange vows, Ayanna spoke first, her voice clear and strong as she pledged to honor the agreement that would preserve peace between their peoples. She spoke in both Lakota and English, ensuring that everyone present understood the gravity of her commitment. Her words were formal and traditional, but Jake detected an underlying strength that suggested she was not merely submitting to circumstances, but actively choosing to make the best of them. Jake's own words felt clumsy and inadequate by comparison, but he meant them when he promised to respect her and her ways. He had spent the afternoon learning the basic phrases he would need, practicing with Swift Arrow until he could pronounce them correctly. When he spoke the Lakota words pledging to protect and honor his new wife, he saw something shift in Ayanna's expression, a flicker of surprise that suggested she had not expected him to make the effort to speak her language. As they shared the ceremonial cup of water from the sacred spring, Jake caught a glimpse of something unexpected in Ayanna's eyes. Not hatred or resignation, but a kind of cautious hope. The water was cool and pure, carrying with it the taste of mountain snow and ancient stone. As they drank, the assembled crowd began to sing, their voices joining in a harmony that seemed to embrace the newlyweds and welcome them into a new phase of their lives. That night, as they sat by their own fire outside the village, Ayanna spoke to him in careful English about the white wolf and what its death meant to her people. She explained the spiritual significance of the creature, how it had been seen as a guardian and protector for as long as anyone could remember. Her voice remained calm and measured, but Jake could hear the pain beneath her words as she described what his single gunshot had destroyed. For the first time, Jake began to understand the magnitude of what he had done. This wasn't just about killing an animal that might have been threatening his livestock. He had destroyed something sacred, something that represented the delicate balance between two worlds. As Ayanna spoke, he found himself seeing the incident from an entirely different perspective, understanding how his practical decision had been interpreted as an act of spiritual warfare. The first weeks of their marriage were marked by careful politeness and growing understanding. Jake had been given his own teepee on the edge of the village, close enough to be part of the community, but far enough away to provide privacy for the unusual couple. The structure was larger and more comfortable than he had expected, with buffalo robes for warmth and beautifully crafted furnishings that spoke of the skill of Lakota artisans. Ayanna visited him daily, initially to fulfill her duties as a wife, but gradually because she found their conversations genuinely interesting. She taught Jake to read the signs that the land provided, how to tell from the behavior of birds whether strangers approached, how to find water in seemingly barren country, how to move through the wilderness without leaving traces that enemies could follow. Her knowledge was encyclopedic and practical, accumulated through years of careful observation, and passed down through generations of tribal wisdom. In return, Jake shared his knowledge of cattle ranching and the ways of the white settlers, helping her understand the pressures and fears that drove his people's actions. He explained the economic realities that forced ranchers to protect their livestock at all costs, the constant threat of bankruptcy that hung over every frontier family, and the cultural beliefs that made many settlers see the wilderness as something to be conquered rather than respected. They discovered that they both loved the early morning hours when the world was still and peaceful, and they began taking long rides together across the vast landscape that was now their shared home. These expeditions served multiple purposes. They allowed Ayanna to continue her work as a healer, gathering medicinal plants and checking on the welfare of animals in the area, while giving Jake a chance to learn about the land from someone who understood it intimately. During these quiet times, Jake found himself drawn to Ayanna's calm wisdom and her deep connection to the natural world. She moved through the landscape like someone who belonged there completely, reading signs and interpreting patterns that were invisible to his untrained eyes. Her knowledge extended far beyond simple survival skills. She understood the complex relationships between different species, the seasonal patterns that governed plant growth, and the subtle changes in weather that could mean the difference between abundance and scarcity. Ayanna, for her part, began to see past Jake's initial mistake to the decent man beneath. She observed how he treated his horse with genuine affection, how he showed respect for the customs of her people even when he didn't understand them, and how he listened carefully when she spoke rather than dismissing her words as primitive superstition. His willingness to learn and adapt impressed her more than she had expected, suggesting that perhaps this marriage might become something more than a political necessity. But their fragile peace was constantly threatened by the growing tensions in Copper Creek. Mayor Hutchins continued to hold rallies demanding Jake's return, claiming that he was being held prisoner by savages who had no right to impose their will on civilized people. His speeches grew more inflammatory each week, painting vivid pictures of what would happen if the territorial government allowed tribal law to supersede American justice. Baron Silver's agents spread rumors about tribal raids and missing cattle, stoking fears that would justify military intervention. They planted stories in the territorial newspapers about savage rituals and white captives, drawing on the darkest fears of frontier settlers to build support for aggressive action against the Lakota. The Baron himself remained carefully in the background, presenting himself as a concerned citizen who only wanted peace and prosperity for the territory. Some of the younger warriors in Ayanna's village grew restless, arguing that the marriage was a sign of weakness and that they should strike first before the white settlers attacked them. They pointed to the increasing hostility from Copper Creek as evidence that diplomacy was futile, that the whites would never accept peaceful coexistence and were simply using the marriage as a delaying tactic while they prepared for war. Chief Standing Bear found himself caught between the old ways that demanded patience and diplomacy, and the new realities of an encroaching world that seemed to respect only force. He had lived through the violent conflicts of the 1860s and understood the terrible cost of war, but he also recognized that his people's survival might depend on their willingness to fight for their rights. The pressure from both sides was enormous, and he could feel the fragile peace he had worked so hard to build beginning to crack under the strain. Through it all, Jake and Ayanna worked to build bridges between their communities, but they could feel the ground shifting beneath their feet like sand in a windstorm. They organized meetings between moderate leaders from both sides, trying to find common ground and practical solutions to the growing tensions. But for every step forward they made, The extremists on both sides seemed determined to take 2 steps back, escalating the rhetoric and making compromise increasingly difficult. It was Ayanna who first noticed that something was wrong with the water. During one of their morning rides, she dismounted near the stream where Jake had killed the white wolf and knelt to examine the muddy banks with the careful attention of someone trained to read the subtle signs of environmental change. Her trained eyes picked out details that others would have missed: the unusual color of certain rocks, the way the vegetation had withered in specific patterns, the absence of the small fish that should have been abundant in these waters. The rocks along the stream bed showed signs of mineral staining that didn't match the natural geology of the area. The plants growing near the water's edge were stunted and discolored, their leaves showing the telltale signs of chemical poisoning. Most disturbing of all, the insects and small animals that normally thrived near water sources were conspicuously absent, suggesting that something had made the area uninhabitable for wildlife. She scooped up a handful of the stream water and sniffed it carefully, her expression growing troubled as she detected the faint but unmistakable odor of industrial chemicals. The water had a metallic taste and a slightly oily texture that spoke of contamination from mining operations. When she shared her suspicions with Jake, he initially dismissed them as superstition, his practical mind struggling to accept that someone would deliberately poison a water source that served both human and animal populations. But Ayanna's quiet insistence made him reconsider. She had never been wrong about environmental signs before, and her knowledge of the natural world far exceeded his own. As she explained what she was seeing, pointing out details that his untrained eyes had missed, Jake began to understand that they might be looking at evidence of a deliberate crime rather than a natural phenomenon. Together, they began to trace the stream back to its source, following a trail that would lead them to a truth more shocking than either had imagined. The investigation required all of Ayanna's tracking skills and Jake's knowledge of the local geography, as they worked to map the water system and identify potential sources of contamination. Their investigation led them through hidden canyons and forgotten valleys, places where few white men had ever set foot and where the landscape retained its primordial wildness. Ayanna's tracking skills proved invaluable as they followed the subtle signs of human activity: broken branches that indicated the passage of heavily loaded wagons, disturbed earth that suggested recent excavation, and the faint traces of chemical residue that spoke of industrial contamination. The trail led them higher into the mountains, through terrain that became increasingly rugged and difficult to navigate. They were forced to abandon their horses and continue on foot, following game trails and ancient paths that wound through forests of pine and aspen. The air grew thinner and colder as they climbed, but the evidence of human activity became more pronounced. Jake's knowledge of the local ranchers and their operations helped them piece together a timeline of events that painted a disturbing picture. He knew which areas had been surveyed for mineral rights, which claims had been filed with the territorial government, and which powerful interests had been quietly buying up land options throughout the region. As they climbed higher into the mountains following the stream to its source, they discovered a series of mining claims that had been filed in secret, far from the prying eyes of both tribal and territorial authorities. The evidence was becoming clear. Someone had been deliberately poisoning the water supply, driving away the wildlife and creating the conditions that had led the desperate white wolf to venture closer to human settlements in search of clean water. The operation was sophisticated and well-funded, suggesting the involvement of someone with significant resources and political connections. As they approached the source of the contamination, they began to encounter signs of active mining operations: discarded equipment, freshly cut timber, and the distinctive scars on the landscape that marked large-scale excavation. The scale of the operation was far larger than anything that could have been accomplished by local prospectors, indicating the involvement of a major mining company with substantial financial backing. The truth hit them like a physical blow when they crested the final ridge and saw the mining operation spread out below them. Baron Silver's men had been working for months to establish a foothold in the mineral-rich mountains, using techniques that contaminated everything downstream. The operation was massive and sophisticated, with steam-powered equipment, carefully engineered drainage systems, and processing facilities that spoke of significant investment and long-term planning. The environmental damage was staggering. Entire hillsides had been stripped of vegetation, streams had been diverted and polluted, and the air was thick with dust and chemical fumes. The white wolf hadn't been hunting Jake's cattle out of predatory instinct. It had been dying of thirst, driven to desperation by the poisoned waters of its traditional territory. Jake felt sick as he realized that he had killed an innocent creature, one that was as much a victim as his own livestock. The wolf had been searching for clean water, forced to venture into unfamiliar territory because its natural habitat had been made uninhabitable. His single gunshot had ended the life of a creature that was already suffering, adding tragedy to an environmental disaster that had been deliberately created. Ayana's face was set in grim lines as she surveyed the devastation, understanding that this was just the beginning of what Baron Silver had planned for their lands. The mining operation was positioned to expand in all directions, eventually encompassing both the Morrison Ranch and significant portions of tribal territory. The poisoning of the water supply was not an accident, but a deliberate strategy to drive away both wildlife and human inhabitants, making it easier to claim the land for industrial development. They had found their enemy, but now they had to figure out how to expose him before he could complete his scheme. The evidence was overwhelming, but they needed to gather proof that would stand up in territorial court and convince both white and Lakota leaders to take action against Baron Silver's operation. The journey back to the village was fraught with danger, as Baron Silver's men had spotted them near the mining site and were now hunting them through the wilderness. The Baron's security force was well armed and experienced, led by a former cavalry officer who understood military tactics and had no qualms about eliminating witnesses to his employer's illegal activities. Jake and Ayana were forced to use every skill they possessed to stay ahead of their pursuers, moving by night and hiding during the day in caves and hidden valleys that only Ayana knew. Her knowledge of the terrain proved invaluable as she led them through secret paths and natural shelters that had been used by her people for generations. Jake's marksmanship and tactical thinking helped them avoid several ambushes, while his understanding of how white men thought allowed them to anticipate their enemies' strategies. During these tense hours, their partnership deepened into something more profound than either had expected. Jake found himself relying completely on Ayana's knowledge and judgment, trusting her decisions even when they seemed to lead them into greater danger. She in turn discovered that his quick thinking and steady courage made him an ideal companion in crisis, someone who could be counted on to remain calm under pressure and make the hard choices that survival demanded. When they were finally cornered in a narrow canyon with nowhere left to run, they fought side by side against overwhelming odds, each protecting the other with a fierce determination that surprised them both. The battle was brief, but intense, with Jake's rifle providing covering fire while Ayana used her intimate knowledge of the terrain to outmaneuver their attackers. Their coordination was perfect, as if they had been fighting together for years rather than weeks. Their escape came through Ayana's intimate knowledge of the land, and Jake's willingness to trust her completely, even when her plan seemed impossible. She led him through a series of hidden passages in the canyon walls, ancient routes known only to her people, and used for centuries as escape routes during times of conflict. The passages were narrow and treacherous, requiring them to crawl through spaces barely wide enough for a human body, but they provided a way out that their pursuers could never have anticipated. When they finally emerged near the village, they carried with them not only the evidence of the mining operation, but also a new understanding of what they meant to each other. The marriage that had begun as a political necessity had transformed into a genuine partnership built on mutual respect and shared purpose. As they approached the village fires, Jake realized that he no longer thought of himself as a prisoner or a reluctant participant in tribal politics. He had found his place in this world, and it was beside the remarkable woman who had become his true partner. The tribal council and the village elders listened in grave silence as Jake and Ayana presented their evidence of Baron Silver's deception. The pieces of the puzzle fell into place with devastating clarity. The poisoned water, the desperate wildlife, the deliberate manipulation of tensions between the settlers and the tribe. The White Wolf's death had been orchestrated from the beginning, part of a larger plan to create the conditions for war and land seizure. Chief Standing Bear's weathered face showed no emotion, but his eyes burned with a cold fire as he contemplated the implications of what they had discovered. The sacred guardian had died not because of Jake's mistake, but because of one man's greed and ambition. The environmental destruction they had witnessed represented not just an attack on the land, but an assault on the spiritual foundations of Lakota culture. The council's discussion was lengthy and heated, conducted in the old language with occasional translations for Jake's benefit. Some of the elders called for immediate war against all white settlers, arguing that Baron Silver's crimes proved that peaceful coexistence was impossible. Others urged caution, pointing out that the Baron's actions were not representative of all whites, and that Jake himself had risked his life to expose the truth. As the council deliberated, Jake felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders, not just for his own actions but for the future of both communities. He understood that his testimony would be crucial in determining whether the evidence against Baron Silver would be accepted by white authorities, and whether justice could be achieved through legal means rather than violence. The confrontation with Baron Silver came at dawn in the main street of Copper Creek, with representatives from both the tribal council and the territorial government present as witnesses. The territorial marshal had arrived the previous evening, summoned by urgent messages from both Chief Standing Bear and the territorial governor, who had been alerted to the situation by Jake's cousin in Kansas. Jake and Ayanna stood together as they presented their evidence: water samples that had been tested by a chemist in the territorial capital, photographs of the mining operation taken with a camera borrowed from the territorial survey office, and testimony from Baron Silver's own workers who had grown disgusted with their employer's methods and were willing to testify against him in exchange for immunity from prosecution. The Baron's carefully constructed facade crumbled under the weight of irrefutable proof. His attempts to deflect blame and claim ignorance of his subordinates' actions only made his guilt more obvious. When confronted with the testimony of his own employees, he finally abandoned his pretense of innocence and began making threats about his political connections and his ability to destroy anyone who opposed him. Mayor Hutchins, realizing that he had been manipulated into serving another man's agenda, publicly withdrew his support for military action against the tribe. His political career was effectively over, but he had enough integrity left to admit his mistakes and apologize for the inflammatory rhetoric that had nearly led to war. The crowd that had once called for war now turned their anger toward the real enemy, who had been playing them all for fools. The territorial marshal placed Baron Silver under arrest on charges of environmental destruction, conspiracy to incite violence, and violation of federal treaties with Native American tribes. The evidence was overwhelming, and the Baron's conviction was virtually certain. His mining operation was shut down immediately, and federal funds were allocated for the cleanup of the environmental damage he had caused. As Baron Silver was led away in chains, Jake and Ayanna found themselves standing at the center of a transformed world. The marriage that had been imposed upon them as punishment had become the foundation for a new kind of relationship between their peoples. The poisoned waters would take time to heal, but the trust that had been built between Jake and Ayanna offered hope for the future. Chief Standing Bear formally adopted Jake into the tribe, giving him a Lakota name that meant truth seeker, and recognizing his role in exposing the conspiracy that had threatened both communities. The territorial governor, impressed by the peaceful resolution of what could have been a devastating conflict, recognized the Lakota's sovereign rights to their ancestral lands and established new protocols for resolving disputes between tribal and territorial authorities. The White Wolf's death had been avenged not through violence, but through the patient work of two people who had learned to see beyond the boundaries that others tried to impose upon them. The sacred spring where the wolf had died was restored and protected, becoming a symbol of the healing that was possible when people chose cooperation over conflict. In the months that followed, Jake and Ayanna worked together to establish new protocols for sharing the land and its resources. Their ranch, which Jake had inherited from his father, became a meeting place where tribal members and settlers could come together to resolve disputes and plan for the future. They developed innovative approaches to cattle ranching that respected traditional Lakota hunting grounds, while also introducing tribal members to new agricultural techniques that could supplement their traditional food sources. Jake learned to speak Lakota fluently, while Ayanna became an advocate for her people in the territorial capital, using her education and diplomatic skills to ensure that tribal interests were represented in government decisions. Their love story became legend throughout the territory, not as a tale of conquest or submission, but as proof that understanding and respect could bridge even the deepest divides. The sacred spring was restored to its natural state, and within a year, wildlife began to return to the area. A new white wolf was spotted near the watering hole, and the tribal elders interpreted its appearance as a sign that the spiritual balance had been restored. Jake and Ayanna's first child was born during the spring of the following year, a daughter who would grow up speaking both languages and understanding both cultures. Their marriage had begun as a sentence imposed by ancient law, but it had evolved into something far more precious, a partnership that proved love could grow from the most unlikely circumstances, and that peace was possible even in the most divided of worlds. The White Wolf's spirit lived on in the harmony they had built together, a harmony that would endure long after the last echoes of Baron Silver's schemes had faded into history.